the row about Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers speech has continued to roll on, and Zarah Sultana has picked out one particular advisor for the bulk of the blame.
When you heard that phrase, an island of strangers, how did you feel?
I was shocked. A Labour Prime Minister literally taken a quote from the Rivers of Blood speech, which Enoch Powell delivered in my hometown of Birmingham. I couldn't actually believe it. And I know that there are some efforts to pretend that this is just a coincidence, just something randomly picked out of air. But as a politician, I can tell you that you don't just get a speech on the day. It is drafted, I imagine, in Downing Street by numerous people. It is probed over, there are edits made, it is fact-checked. So for me, someone had Enoch Powell's speech on a PDF and was picking quotes, and that's how that phrase was in that speech, and that to me is highly concerning.
You tweeted today, everyone knows exactly who that person is. Who is it?
Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise, but I believe that that is Morgan McSweeney.
He's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff.
Absolutely, and we know that no decision in Downing Street takes place without his approval, so he definitely would have had sign-off, but the Prime Minister himself approved of those words and delivered that speech, so the buck lies with the Prime Minister.
Obviously, Morgan McSweeney's not here, as we can all see, so we don't know if that's true or not.
Let's get up the relevant passages from Starmer's speech and the infamous Rivers of Blood speech. This is what Starmer said. Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not. But either way, they give shape to our values. They guide us towards our rights, of course, but also our responsibilities, the obligations we owe to one another. Now, in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Without them, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. This is the quote from the Powell speech, where he uses the term strangers. But while to the immigrant, entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different, for reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own land, or in their own country, sorry. Ash, I want to go to you on this. I upset a few people on Monday when I said, I'm not sure these points are exactly the same. Obviously, they used one of the same words, but they seem to be making slightly different points. What's your take?
So I've got to say, Michael, I disagreed with you a little bit because I think there was a couple of things that maybe you should have taken into account, in my opinion. The first thing is that, in your view, you thought that the outrage or the outcry was a bit over-egged. I think what that doesn't take into account is that the outrage is part of the political theatre that Keir Starmer is trying to pursue, because the Labour head honchos and strategists have sat down, they looked at the local election results, and they're going, how do we respond to the rise of reform? Now, rather than responding to the rise of reform by saying, okay, we're going to do economic populism, they're doing the same thing that they always do, which is they go, oh, why don't we try and do like a little bit of populist nationalism? Let's bash on the immigrants. And bonus, because you are going to get a whole load of outrage from the left, we're signalling that we're not the party of progressive, cosmopolitan, soft on migration, namby-pamby graduates and wokies. All right. So I firmly believe that the outrage is not a product of a mistaken reading on the part of the people who are upset by it. I think that it's a core component of what Keir Starmer and his advisors wanted to achieve. The second thing is that when you look at the context of both uses of the word stranger, there are some similarities. Now, for Keir Starmer, he does some padding. He says, I celebrate the fact we're a diverse nation, but it's coming within the context of this idea of there are rules and there are responsibilities, as well as rights, privileges, and opportunities. Similarly, Enoch Powell is talking about the immigrant who comes here in pursuit of opportunities and privileges. So what we've ended up with Keir Starmer is Diet Powell. The reason why maybe I'm less shocked than other people about that, and I've written about this both in my book, and I wrote an article about this a few years ago, is that pretty much every single prime minister has dipped a toe into the Enoch Powell paddling pool. Because while Enoch Powell was forced to resign from the Conservative front bench, Powellism itself became the dominant frame through which immigration was understood. So it was about immigration, race, belonging, and a sense of apocalypse. So then if you go looking through Keir Starmer's speech and you see some other instances of, very negative language, you've got the phrase squalid chapter, referring to the high immigration of the Boris Johnson and the latter portion of the Conservative government's post 2010. You've also got incalculable damage. Now, Keir Starmer doesn't use words like squalid chapter to talk about the decade of lost pay growth. He doesn't talk about incalculable damage when he's thinking about the missed opportunities to decarbonize our economy or to get feces out of our waterways. This is a set of terminology which is seemingly exclusively reserved to talk about immigration, so that people who are being drawn to full fat nationalist populist parties can think that Keir Starmer is siding with them a bit. And it's not going to work. It never really has worked for Labour prime ministers. When you go back to the early 2000s, when Tony Blair and David Blunkett really, really lent into this idea of an anti-asylum crackdown, it strengthened the hand of the BNP, who, got some of their first councillors ever in the local elections of the early 2000s. So this is where I disagree with you, Michael, is that one, I think the outrage was calculated. Two, I think the little nod and a wink to Powell with just enough plausible deniability, I think was part of the plan. Three, I think that there is a long history of Powellism enduring in this country. And four, I don't know if I said this already as number one. I always lose count when I do a list, but I think it's going to backfire.
I mean, I 100% agree with you that I think this was calculated. I think they wanted to do this speech to provoke a row with the left so that they could position themselves on the side of border restrictions. I think that's what they wanted to do. I think they realized, people have said, why couldn't you have just used different terms? Well, unless there's a row, no one hears about it. Keir Starmer's given so many speeches about policy that no one notices. So they thought the only way to get people to notice this is to have a row. I suppose where I am concerned about sort of the reaction of the left is I think they've probably given them what they want, because what the Starmer people want is they want to provoke a row that they think will outrage people on the left, that the majority of the country will see as not that outrageous. And that's why, it wasn't a speech where he said multiculturalism's terrible. He just said we need to sort of enforce rules, and we maybe need to have migration not as fast as it has been, so that we can have social cohesion. And I think that sort of it was an intentional attempt to put himself on the side of the majority against the left, who he can call oversensitive. And I think that maybe the left sort of jumped straight into the trap, as it were. Like we've talked about this with Donald Trump all the time. Always after the election, when the right winger wins, we say, oh, maybe when the left was this outraged about something, the general population weren't similarly outraged. Maybe we got a bit carried away. And I feel like maybe that could be happening this time again. Let's just go to this YouGov poll. Obviously, this isn't an end to the debate. I'm going to come back to you afterwards. So in a speech yesterday, Keir Starmer said that without fair immigration rules, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. Which of the following comes closest to your view? I agree with the sentiment and take no issue with the language. That's 41% of voters in general, 37% of Labour voters. I agree with the sentiment, but don't think the language was appropriate. That's 12% of all voters, 15% of Labour. I disagree with the sentiment, but take no issue with the language. That's 9% of all voters, 9% of Labour. And then I disagree with the sentiment and don't think the language was appropriate. So that's 18% of people, 21% of Labour. Don't know is 20%. Now, I actually think those middle options are a bit too confusing and people didn't really know what they were saying. So I'd pay more attention to the 41% and the 18% who were people saying, I liked it and I didn't like it. Ash, what do you make of my sort of point that I suppose by taking the bait of he said something which is, when you look at it literally, not that extreme, but it has pushed the buttons that really wind up the left. And that's probably exactly what Keir Starmer wanted to do, so that he could make himself seem like the guy who's the common sense against people who are, in his mind, to his strategists, hysterical.
All right. Two very, very quick questions for you, Michael. Firstly, simple yes or no will do. Do you think that the Rivers of Blood speech was a racist speech and an unacceptable speech?
Yes.
Right. So, would it surprise you to learn that a poll in 1968, shortly after the speech itself, found that 74% of respondents agreed with it?
No, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Does that make it
But-
not racist?
No, I'm not saying this doesn't make, but I feel like you're saying it's racist. Do you literally think it's racist, this speech? Or do you think it's
No. The thing
potentially playing to something which is racist? I mean, because I don't think he said anything racist. I think people think that maybe he was trying to sort of dog whistle to sort of appeal to racist sentiment. But, if Keir Starmer had given a speech like Enoch Powell had given, whether or not the public thought it was great, I think it would have been a racist speech. But this speech, especially in that passage, he was saying, if we don't have rules, then we'll become an island of strangers. Not if we have immigrants, we'll become an island of strangers.
But the point I'm making is that when you introduce polling and it's like, okay, well, the left are out of step with the country when it comes to Keir Starmer's speech, is that actually critics of Enoch Powell were out of step with the country at the time of the Rivers of Blood speech. So again, when you take that step back and you look at the historical view, how we remember the Rivers of Blood speech as this kind of notorious chapter in British politics, I think underplays two things. One is the enduring legacy of the speech and the fact that even though Enoch Powell as a political figure was toppled and defeated, Powellism grew, I think, in many ways from strength to strength. It became the dominant frame through which we understand immigration discourses. And then the second thing is that people always forget how popular it was at the time. It really did chime with a lot of the country. You had protests of dockers who had signs saying Dockers for Enoch. And in a way which I think you could draw certain parallels with today, you had elements of, the, full fat far right, presenting themselves as union men and on the left and the left behind workers to come out and support for Enoch Powell. So I think that there are all sorts of parallels you can draw from then and today. I agree with you that, there is a clear difference between what I believe to be the dog whistling of Keir Starmer and the explicit demographic panic and apocalypse of Enoch Powell's speech. You can't compare the two. But again, going back to Keir Starmer's speech, you see the language around immigration is overwhelmingly and powerfully negative. And then you've got this, but I actually like diversity, right? So I think that there's a certain dishonesty to it. And there is an attempt to drape anti-immigration sentiments with plausible deniability because, the Labour Party is still a centre-left party in relative terms, not absolute terms. I think there's one last thing I'd like to say if I've got the time, which is this idea that immigration makes us strangers to each other. So as you well know, Michael, I live in Tottenham, and I'm a big fan of Tottenham in every respect, not just the team, but the place where I live. And I have never felt more a part of community than I have living here. It is an incredibly diverse neighborhood. You've obviously got a significant Caribbean population, lots of West Africans. You've got a lot of Colombians and Ecuadorians, Polish, Romanian, Filipino, and how that plays out in terms of the ways in which people live. On New Year's Eve, just a couple of streets away from me, the Filipino families get together and they let off fireworks and everybody comes out from the local streets. Nobody else does that. The white British families don't do that. It's the Filipino families. In the summertime, the sort of glorious weather that we're enjoying now, you've got like the local like Caribbean dudes setting up sound systems in the park. It's really nice. It's an opportunity to get to know people. Similarly, during the spring and summertime, you've got the local Latin American community getting together in the park, setting up gazebos. They've got these massive boxes of empanadas. They sometimes set up barbecues and they play all day football tournaments. So I don't disagree that we live in an age of increasing social atomization, of loneliness, of anomie, as Aaron put it in his Novara live just the other day. But actually, when you look at immigrant communities and cultures, sometimes what we're importing, if we're going to use that word, is we're importing cultures with a greater sense of community and social connection than our own. So I wouldn't say that immigrants are breaking down the bonds of social connection. Actually, part of my experience living here in Tottenham is that it's immigrant communities who are keeping some of those traditions alive.
I mean, he didn't explicitly say that either. I think you're saying that. Well, I mean, I don't know. We could talk about this for a lot longer, but we have a guest ready to speak to us.